She was 6 months pregnant, radiating the glow of expectant motherhood when she walked into her husband's bedroom, carrying his favorite homemade meal, and discovered him with his secretary sprawled across their marital bed. The betrayal cut deep enough, but when the mistress spotted her standing there, belly swollen with child, she showed no remorse. Instead, she sneered coldly and said, "Finally, the pathetic whale knows." Then she lunged forward and delivered a vicious punch directly to Isabella's pregnant stomach, sending her crashing against the dresser in agony. What neither her cheating husband Daniel nor his vindictive mistress realized was that Isabella wasn't just any ordinary pregnant housewife. She was the estranged daughter of tech mogul Richard Salvatore, who had been searching for her for 15 years. And within 24 hours, Daniel would learn that attacking a Salvatore brought consequences that would obliterate his world entirely. Isabella Rodriguez had always been the reserved type, preferring literature to social gatherings and seeing goodness in others, sometimes to her own disadvantage. At 29, she had dedicated 8 years of her existence to being the ideal wife to Daniel Crawford, a mid-tier marketing executive who treated their modest townhouse like a hotel and her like unpaid help. She had abandoned her aspirations of completing her doctorate in English literature to support his ambitions, working part-time at a neighborhood library to contribute to expenses while maintaining their household with meticulous care. The pregnancy had been unexpected, but Isabella welcomed it with the intense joy that characterized everything she pursued. She devoured every pregnancy guide, attended every appointment alone because Daniel was perpetually too occupied with clients, and spent her evenings crocheting tiny blankets while he worked late at the office. Or so she believed. Daniel Crawford was Isabella's complete opposite. Boisterous, driven, and entirely convinced he deserved more than his current circumstances. At 34, he had grown bitter about their modest lifestyle, their small townhouse, and what he perceived as Isabella's lack of refinement. He wanted a partner who could schmooze at corporate events, who appreciated fine wine, and could discuss market analysis, not someone who got excited about library fundraisers and homemade bread recipes. Enter Scarlett Pierce, his new assistant at Summit Marketing. 25, platinum blonde, and ruthlessly ambitious. She had made it obvious from her first day that she was interested in more than scheduling and correspondence. She wore designer imitations, spoke confidently about topics she'd read in business publications, and most crucially, she made Daniel feel significant. She laughed at his jokes, praised his shirt selections, and never asked him to help with domestic duties or discuss baby preparations. Their affair had begun 4 months ago, coinciding with Isabella entering her second trimester. Daniel convinced himself it wasn't really infidelity since Isabella was so preoccupied with the pregnancy anyway. He deserved some attention, some excitement. Scarlett made him feel like the successful executive he imagined himself to be rather than the middle manager barely making ends meet that he actually was. On that fateful Wednesday afternoon, Isabella had been feeling particularly nurturing. She'd spent the morning preparing Daniel's preferred dish, honey-glazed chicken with roasted potatoes, thinking it might be nice to surprise him at home during his lunch break. They hadn't been connecting much lately, and she hoped a romantic meal might rekindle some of their intimacy before the baby arrived. Their bedroom was on the second floor of their modest 2-story townhouse. Isabella had climbed those stairs thousands of times in 8 years of marriage, but never with the growing sense of dread that accompanied her that day. She knew something was wrong the moment she reached the landing and heard unfamiliar laughter coming from behind their bedroom door. She paused outside, her hand trembling on the handle, telling herself she was being paranoid, that pregnancy hormones were making her imagine things. Then she heard Daniel's voice, low and tender. "God, Scarlett, you're amazing. Isabella never makes me feel like this." The words struck her like a physical blow. Isabella stood there for a moment, 6 months pregnant with his child, holding his favorite meal, listening to her husband tell another woman how inadequate she was. Part of her wanted to retreat, go downstairs, pretend she'd never heard anything. But a stronger part, the part that had survived losing her parents and putting herself through graduate school and never backed down from adversity, made her turn that handle. Daniel was lying back against their headboard, his shirt unbuttoned while Scarlett straddled him in lingerie, so revealing it barely qualified as clothing. They were intimate and devastating, made worse by how natural they appeared together. How comfortable. Isabella. Daniel jerked away so violently he nearly fell off the bed. What are you doing here? Isabella couldn't speak. She just stood there, meal container in hand, belly prominent in her simple maternity top, staring at the scene that destroyed her marriage in an instant. This wasn't some momentary lapse of judgment or drunken mistake. This was a relationship complete with inside jokes and casual intimacy, and the kind of chemistry she hadn't experienced with Daniel in years. Scarlett, however, was not similarly frozen. She climbed off the bed slowly, adjusting her lingerie with deliberate casualness. "Oh," she said, her voice dripping with false surprise. "You must be the wife." The way she said it, like Isabella was some irrelevant stranger rather than the woman Daniel had promised to love and honor, sent a surge of fury through Isabella's shock. 8 years, Isabella said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. 8 years of marriage, and this is how— Look, Isabella, Daniel interrupted, running his hands through his hair. You don't understand. This isn't. It's not what it looks like. Scarlett let out a sharp laugh. Really, Daniel? We're going with that? She turned to Isabella with a smile that was pure malice. Honey, it's exactly what it looks like. Daniel and I have been together for months. We're in love. The word love hit Isabella like a slap. She looked at Daniel, searching his face for some denial, some indication that Scarlett was lying or exaggerating. Instead, she saw guilt and something worse, relief. He was relieved to be caught. Is that true? Isabella asked him directly. Daniel couldn't meet her eyes. Isabella, you have to understand, is it true? She repeated, louder this time. Yes, he said finally. Yes, it's true. I love her. Isabella felt something shatter inside her chest. Something that had nothing to do with her heart and everything to do with her faith in basic human decency. She'd known their marriage wasn't perfect, but she'd never imagined this level of betrayal, this kind of calculated cruelty. She set the meal container down carefully on the dresser. I made your favorite, she said absently. Honey-glazed chicken. Isabella, I've been making your favorites for 8 years, she continued, her voice growing stronger. Every birthday, every anniversary, every random Wednesday when I thought you might be having a difficult day at work. I gave up my doctorate for you. I gave up my dreams for you. I gave up everything for you. Scarlett rolled her eyes dramatically. Oh, please spare us the martyr routine. You think making dinner and doing laundry makes you some kind of saint? You're boring, honey. You're plain and boring, and you never wanted to be anything more than a housewife. Isabella turned to look at her, really look at her for the first time. Scarlett was beautiful in the artificial way of someone who spent more on cosmetics than Isabella spent on groceries. She was young and confident and cruel, the kind of woman who took what she wanted without considering the consequences. You don't know anything about me, Isabella said calmly. I know enough, Scarlett shot back. I know Daniel was miserable with you. I know he's been planning to leave you for weeks. We were just waiting for the right time. After the baby? Isabella asked, her hand moving instinctively to her belly. Daniel flinched. Isabella, we can work something out with custody. Finally, the pathetic whale knows, Scarlett interrupted with a vicious smile. She was enjoying this, Isabella realized. The other woman was actually taking pleasure in destroying a pregnant woman's life. Isabella stared at her in shock. In all her 29 years, through losing her parents and college struggles and every challenge life had thrown her way, she had never encountered such casual cruelty. And that's when Scarlett made the mistake that would cost both her and Daniel everything. Maybe it was the pregnancy hormones, or maybe it was just the intoxication of finally speaking her truth. But Scarlett wasn't done. You know what? I'm glad you found out this way, she continued, taking a step closer to Isabella. Because now you can stop living in this pathetic fantasy where you matter, where anyone could love someone like you. Isabella could feel tears starting, could feel the weight of 8 years of trying to be enough for a man who was never going to appreciate her. But then Scarlett kept talking. Look at you, she sneered, gesturing at Isabella's simple clothes, her comfortable shoes, her makeup-free face. You're nothing. You're nobody. You're just a fat, pregnant nobody who never had a chance of keeping a man like Daniel. And then, perhaps carried away by her own cruelty, Scarlett stepped forward and delivered a vicious punch directly to Isabella's pregnant stomach, her fist connecting with Isabella's belly and sending her stumbling backward. Isabella's back hit the dresser hard enough to knock the wind out of her, her hands flying instinctively to protect her belly as she struggled to catch her breath. For a terrifying moment, she felt a sharp pain in her abdomen and thought something might be wrong with the baby. "Scarlett," Daniel shouted, but he didn't move to help Isabella. He just stood there, torn between his mistress and his pregnant wife, choosing neither. Isabella stayed against the dresser for a long moment, waiting for the pain to subside, making sure the baby was okay. When she finally looked up, she saw Scarlett smirking with satisfaction and Daniel looking uncomfortable but not apologetic. "You punched me," Isabella said, her voice filled with something that might have been wonder. "You punched a pregnant woman." "You were in my way," Scarlett said with a shrug. That's when something shifted in Isabella's eyes. The shock and hurt were still there, but underneath them was something else, something colder and infinitely more dangerous. She straightened slowly, her hands still protective over her belly, and looked at both of them with a clarity that hadn't been there before. "You have no idea what you just did," Isabella said quietly. "Either of you." Daniel frowned. "Isabella, you're being dramatic. My name," Isabella interrupted, "isn't Isabella Rodriguez. It hasn't been for 15 years. She reached into her purse and pulled out her driver's license, holding it up so they could see it clearly. "It's Isabella Salvatore. I'm Richard Salvatore's daughter." For a moment, neither Daniel nor Scarlett reacted. The name clearly meant nothing to them. Then Daniel's frown deepened. "Salvatore," he repeated slowly. "Like Salvatore Technologies? That's Salvatore?" Isabella smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "That's Salvatore. The billionaire you always complained was disrupting the marketing industry with his tech innovations. The man whose company is worth more than the GDP of most small countries. That's my father." The color drained from Daniel's face as the implications hit him. Richard Salvatore wasn't just wealthy. He was powerful, connected, and notoriously protective of his family. He was also known for his ruthless business practices and his ability to destroy competitors who crossed him. But you said your parents were dead," Daniel stammered. "You said you grew up in foster care." "I did grow up in foster care," Isabella confirmed. "Because I ran away from home when I was 14 after a fight with my father. I was young and stupid and proud, and I thought I could make it on my own. I legally changed my name when I turned 18, and I've been Isabella Rodriguez ever since." She turned to Scarlett, who was looking confused and increasingly pale. "You want to know why I never wanted to be anything more than a housewife? Because I spent my childhood watching what wealth and power do to people. I wanted a simple life with a good man who loved me for who I was, not what my family could give him." Isabella laughed, and the sound was bitter. "I actually thought I'd found that with you, Daniel. I thought you loved me for me. I was wrong about that, wasn't I?" Daniel was doing rapid calculations in his head. Salvatore Technologies had been in the news just last week, a merger that had made Richard Salvatore one of the richest men in America. If Isabella was really his daughter. "Isabella," he said carefully, "we should talk about this privately." "Oh, now you want to talk privately," Isabella observed. "When you thought I was nobody, you were perfectly fine having your mistress humiliate me in our own bedroom. But now that you know who my father is, suddenly you want privacy." Scarlett was catching on now, and her face was white with fear. "You're lying," she said, but her voice shook. "You're making this up." Isabella pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found what she was looking for. She held the phone up so they could see the screen. The contact read, "Dad, R. Salvatore," with a number that had far too many digits to be anything but international. "I haven't spoken to him in 15 years, Isabella said conversationally. "We had a terrible fight about my boyfriend at the time. Ironically, he said the boy was just using me for money, and I accused him of being paranoid and controlling. I was so angry that I ran away and never went back." She looked down at her phone thoughtfully. "But he never stopped looking for me. I get reports sometimes from private investigators he's hired. He always made sure they knew to tell me that he loved me and wanted me to come home, but that he'd respect my decision if I wanted to stay hidden." Isabella's fingers hovered over the call button. "The thing is, I think he stopped looking as actively in recent years because I seemed happy, married, stable, living a quiet life. But attacking his pregnant daughter? Well, that changes things, doesn't it?" "Isabella, wait," Daniel said, panic creeping into his voice. "Let's think about this rationally." "Rationally," Isabella repeated. "Like how you rationally decided to cheat on your pregnant wife." Or like how your girlfriend here rationally decided to physically assault me. She looked at Scarlett, who was now visibly shaking. You wanted to know who I really was? Let me tell you. I'm the daughter of a man who once bought an entire media company because they ran a negative story about his assistant. I'm the daughter of a man who's been known to destroy entire corporations because they crossed him in minor ways. I'm the daughter of a man who loves me more than anything in this world and has been waiting 15 years for me to come home. Isabella pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Speaking in rapid Italian, Isabella responded in the same language. And even though neither Daniel nor Scarlett understood the words, they could hear the emotion in both voices: surprise, joy, love, and then, as Isabella's tone changed, growing fury. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like hours to the two people watching. They could hear Isabella explaining the situation, could hear the sharp questions from the other end of the line, could hear Isabella's voice growing steadier and more confident with every exchange. When she finally hung up, Isabella looked at Daniel and Scarlett with an expression of calm certainty that was more terrifying than any rage could have been. He's sending a plane, she said simply. It should be here within the hour. He wants to meet his grandchild's father, and he's very interested in meeting the woman who thought it was appropriate to assault his pregnant daughter. Daniel made a sound that might have been a whimper. Isabella, please, you have to understand. I understand perfectly, Isabella cut him off. I understand that you never loved me. I understand that you were planning to abandon me and your child. I understand that you're both exactly the kind of people my father warned me about. She moved toward the door, then paused to look back at them. Oh, and Daniel, you might want to start updating your resume, because as of this afternoon, Salvatore Technologies will own a controlling interest in Summit Marketing. Hostile takeover, you understand? Dad's very good at those. She picked up the meal container she'd brought. I should probably take this with me. Somehow, I don't think you'll be very hungry for the next few days. Isabella walked out of that bedroom with her head high and her heart breaking. But underneath the pain was something she hadn't felt in years, the knowledge that she wasn't powerless, wasn't nobody, wasn't alone. She was a Salvatore, and whatever came next, she wouldn't face it as the discarded wife of a mediocre marketing executive. She would face it as the beloved daughter of one of the most powerful men in America. The plane that landed at the city's private airfield 90 minutes later was a Bombardier Global 7500, the kind of aircraft that cost more than most people earned in multiple lifetimes. Isabella stood on the tarmac, still in her simple maternity outfit, but somehow transformed, watching as the stairs lowered and her father appeared in the doorway. Richard Salvatore was 64 years old, silver-haired, and commanding in the way that only truly powerful men could be. He was also crying as he walked down those stairs toward the daughter he'd lost 15 years ago. Isabella, he said in Italian. Mia cara bambina. Papa, she whispered. And then she was in his arms, sobbing for everything she'd lost and everything she was about to gain. Behind Richard came a small army of people, lawyers, executives, bodyguards, and assistants. Isabella recognized the type from her childhood, the kind of entourage that surrounded her father wherever he went, ready to execute his will with ruthless efficiency. Tell me everything, Richard said quietly, his hands gentle on her face as he examined the bruise forming on her stomach where she'd been punched. Isabella told him every detail, every betrayal, every moment of the last 8 years when she'd settled for less than she deserved because she'd forgotten who she was. And as she spoke, she watched her father's face transform from loving concern to something far more dangerous. She hit you, Richard said quietly. She hit my grandchild. Daniel just watched, Isabella added. Richard nodded slowly, then turned to one of his lawyers. I want to know everything about both of them. I want to know what they owe, who they owe it to, where they work, where they shop, where they get their coffee. I want their entire lives mapped out within the hour. The lawyer nodded and immediately began making calls. Papa, you don't have to. They hurt my daughter, Richard said simply. They hurt my grandchild. There are consequences for such things. While the lawyers worked, Richard held Isabella close, making up for 15 years of missed conversations in the space of an hour. He told her about the company, about the fortune that would someday be hers, about the grandfather who'd died missing her, and the grandmother who'd left everything to Isabella in her will. You're worth approximately $3 billion, Richard said casually, as if discussing the weather. Your trust fund has been growing for 15 years. The villa in Santorini that you loved as a child is still yours. And there's a penthouse in Chicago that I've kept exactly as you left it, just in case you ever wanted to come home. Isabella stared at him. $3 billion. She'd been clipping coupons and working part-time at a library while sitting on a fortune that could solve every problem she'd ever had. But I ran away, she said. I said terrible things. You were 14 and in love, Richard said with a smile. I was overprotective and controlling. We were both wrong, Tesoro. What matters is that you're here now. One of the lawyers approached them discreetly. Sir, we've completed the initial research on the subjects. Richard looked at Isabella. Do you want to know what we found? Isabella hesitated. Part of her wanted to just leave, take her father's hand, and disappear from this life forever. But another part, the part that had been humiliated and betrayed and physically assaulted, wanted justice. Tell me, she said. The lawyer consulted his tablet. Daniel Crawford, age 34, middle management at Summit Marketing, salary $72,000 annually, currently 4 months behind on mortgage payments, carries $51,000 in credit card debt, and recently took out a personal loan for $18,000. His employment record shows consistent mediocrity and several complaints from female colleagues about inappropriate behavior. Isabella wasn't surprised by any of that, but it still hurt to hear her marriage reduced to such stark terms. Scarlett Pierce, age 25, the lawyer continued, recently hired as assistant at Summit Marketing after being terminated from 2 previous positions for inappropriate relationships with supervisors. Currently behind on student loan payments, drives a leased Mercedes that she cannot afford, and has been using Daniel Crawford's credit cards for personal purchases. She's been using his credit cards? Isabella asked. Approximately $9,000 in charges over the past 3 months, the lawyer confirmed. Designer clothing, jewelry, spa treatments, and a weekend trip to Miami that Mr. Crawford's wife presumably knew nothing about. Isabella felt a bitter laugh bubble up. Daniel had been complaining for months about money being tight, asking her to cut back on groceries, while his mistress spent thousands on designer handbags. What else? Richard asked quietly. Summit Marketing is privately owned by the Peterson Group, which has been looking to sell for the past 18 months. They've been struggling financially and would likely accept any reasonable offer. As for the individuals, both Mr. Crawford and Ms. Pierce have several vulnerabilities that could be exploited, should you choose to do so. Richard looked at Isabella. It's your choice, Cara. We can make them disappear from your life entirely, or we can ensure they face consequences for their actions. Either way, you never have to see them again. Isabella thought about it. She thought about 8 years of putting Daniel first, of making herself smaller so he could feel bigger, of believing that her dreams mattered less than his comfort. She thought about Scarlett's cruel smile, the casual way she'd punched a pregnant woman, the vicious pleasure she'd taken in Isabella's pain. I want them to understand what they've lost, Isabella said finally. I want them to know exactly who they chose to betray. Richard smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Consider it done. By 6 o'clock that afternoon, the wheels of justice were already in motion. Salvatore Technologies announced its acquisition of the Peterson Group, including all subsidiary companies, in a deal worth $250 million. The announcement made national news, not just for the size of the transaction, but for the speed at which it had been completed. Daniel first learned about it when his boss called an emergency meeting for all employees. He sat in the conference room with his colleagues, still reeling from Isabella's revelation and the cryptic threat about her father taking over the company. Surely, she'd been bluffing. Surely, no one could move that fast, even a billionaire. Then the CEO of Summit Marketing walked into the room looking like he'd aged 10 years in a single afternoon. As of 5 p.m. today, the CEO announced, Summit Marketing is now owned by Salvatore Technologies. We are assured that there will be no immediate changes to day-to-day operations, but there will likely be some restructuring in the coming weeks. Daniel felt his world tilt. Salvatore Technologies. Isabella hadn't been bluffing after all. Sir, one of his colleagues asked, do we know what kind of restructuring they have in mind? The CEO's eyes found Daniel across the room, and his expression was grim. I believe some personnel changes are likely, particularly in cases where employee behavior has not met company standards. Daniel's mouth went dry. He tried to catch the CEO's eye, tried to communicate somehow that this was all a misunderstanding, but the older man looked away. The meeting ended with assurances that everyone would be kept informed as changes developed. But Daniel knew he was living on borrowed time. He stumbled back to his office, his mind racing with calculations. If Isabella was really Richard Salvatore's daughter, if she really had access to that kind of money and power, then his life as he knew it was over. He found Scarlett at her desk frantically packing her belongings into a cardboard box. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Getting out of here," she said without looking up. "Someone from HR called 10 minutes ago. My employment has been terminated effective immediately. Apparently, there have been some concerns about my conduct with supervisors." Daniel felt his last hope crumble. "Did they say anything about me?" Scarlett looked up at him then, and her expression was pure venom. "Are you kidding me? You told me she was nobody. You told me her family had no money, nothing special. You never mentioned her father was Richard fucking Salvatore." "I didn't know," Daniel protested. "She never told me." "Well, congratulations," Scarlett snarled. "Because of your lies, I've lost my job. My references are destroyed. And apparently, Salvatore Technologies has enough influence to make sure I never work in this industry again." She hefted the box and pushed past him. "This is all your fault. You and your pathetic midlife crisis. I hope it was worth it." Scarlett was gone by 6:30, taking her designer clothes and her cruelty with her, leaving Daniel alone in his office to contemplate the ruins of his life. At exactly 7 p.m., Daniel's phone rang. The caller ID showed Salvatore Technologies. "Mr. Crawford," said a polite voice. "This is Michael Bennett, Mr. Salvatore's personal attorney. Mr. Salvatore would like to meet with you this evening to discuss your marriage to his daughter, Isabella. Are you available?" Daniel's hands shook as he held the phone. Yes, I suppose I could." "Excellent. A car will pick you up at your office building at 8 p.m. Please bring any documentation you have regarding your marriage, finances, and recent activities with Ms. Pierce." The line went dead. Daniel spent the next hour in a cold sweat, trying to figure out how to explain or justify what Richard Salvatore had undoubtedly already learned. How do you tell a billionaire that you cheated on his daughter because you were bored? How do you justify allowing your mistress to assault a pregnant woman? The car that picked him up was a black sedan with tinted windows, and the driver said nothing during the 40-minute trip to a downtown office building. Daniel was escorted to the top floor, where Richard Salvatore waited in a conference room that probably cost more than Daniel's annual salary. Richard was not alone. Flanked by lawyers, accountants, and what looked like private investigators, he sat at the head of a long table covered with documents. Isabella sat beside him, transformed from the woman Daniel had married into someone he barely recognized. She wore a simple but clearly expensive dress. Her hair was professionally styled, and she carried herself with a confidence that took his breath away. "Sit," Richard said without preamble. Daniel sat. Richard slid a thick folder across the table. "These are the divorce papers. You will sign them tonight. Isabella is asking for nothing from you. No alimony, no division of assets, nothing. In exchange, you will relinquish all parental rights to the child she's carrying." "What?" Daniel looked up sharply. "I can't sign away my rights to my own child." "You can and you will," Richard said calmly, "because the alternative is much worse for you." Another folder slid across the table. "This contains documentation of your affair, including credit card records showing that you used marital funds to support your mistress. It also contains witness statements about Ms. Pierce's assault on Isabella, security footage from your building, and evidence of financial fraud relating to your use of company resources for personal relationships." Daniel's hands trembled as he opened the folder. It was all there: receipts, photos, statements, bank records. They'd assembled a complete picture of his betrayal in a matter of hours. "Any one of these issues could result in criminal charges," Richard continued. "Taken together, they represent grounds for a lawsuit that would destroy you financially and professionally for the rest of your life." Isabella spoke for the first time. "I don't want your money, Daniel. I don't want anything from you. I just want you out of my life and away from my child." Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a stranger. This wasn't the quiet, accommodating woman he'd married. This was someone powerful, someone connected, someone who could destroy him with a phone call. "If I sign these papers," he said slowly, "what happens to me?" Richard's smile was cold. "You get to disappear quietly. You'll be terminated from Summit Marketing tomorrow morning with cause, which means no severance and no references. Your mortgage will be called in immediately. Salvatore Technologies now owns the bank that holds your loan. You'll have 30 days to vacate the house. Daniel felt sick. Where am I supposed to go? How am I supposed to live? That's not my concern, Richard said. You should have thought about consequences before you betrayed my daughter. But I have nowhere to go. No job, no money. You'll have whatever you can carry, Isabella said quietly. Everything else belongs to the life you chose to destroy. The reality of his situation hit Daniel like a physical blow. He'd lost everything, his job, his house, his marriage, his unborn child, in the span of 10 hours. All because he'd been stupid enough to underestimate the quiet woman who'd loved him. With shaking hands, he signed the papers. Isabella felt no satisfaction watching Daniel's world crumble. There was no joy in revenge, only a hollow sense of justice and the relief that came with finally walking away from a life that had never truly fit her. As Daniel was escorted out of the building by security, Isabella turned to her father. What happens now? Now, Richard said, you come home. There's someone I want you to meet. The someone turned out to be Dr. Antonio Benedetti, a cardiovascular surgeon who ran free clinics in some of Italy's poorest neighborhoods. He was Richard's business partner in several philanthropic ventures, and he had flown in from Milan the moment Richard called to tell him about Isabella's return. Antonio has been asking about you for years, Richard said as they drove toward the family estate on the outskirts of the city. He was devastated when you disappeared. He's never married, you know. Says he's been waiting for the right woman. Isabella remembered Antonio dimly from her childhood, a serious young man who'd been studying medicine and working with her father's foundation. He'd been kind to the teenage Isabella, treating her with respect when most of her father's associates barely acknowledged her existence. They met again in the library of her childhood home, a room that had been preserved exactly as she'd left it 15 years ago. Antonio was 45 now, distinguished and graying at the temples, but his eyes were the same warm brown she remembered. Isabella, he said softly, you're even more beautiful than I imagined you'd become. Antonio, she replied, surprised by how naturally his name came. Papa says you've been asking about me. Every day for 15 years, he confirmed. I always hoped you'd come home eventually. They talked for hours that night about his work with children, her abandoned dreams of literature, the baby growing inside her, and the future that stretched ahead of them both. Antonio had built an empire of his own, medical centers, research facilities, and charitable foundations that served children around the world. He was wealthy in his own right. But more importantly, he was good in a way that reminded Isabella why she'd wanted a simple life in the first place. I've made mistakes, Isabella told him honestly. I married a man who didn't love me. I wasted 8 years trying to be someone I wasn't. We've all made mistakes, Antonio replied. The question is what we do next. What Isabella did next was rebuild her life from the ground up. She moved into the Chicago penthouse her father had kept for her, enrolled in a graduate program to finish her doctorate, and began working with Antonio's foundation to establish literacy programs in underserved communities. Daniel, meanwhile, discovered that Richard Salvatore's reach extended far beyond the marketing industry. No company would hire him. Salvatore Technologies had an extensive network of business relationships, and word had quietly gone out that Daniel Crawford was persona non grata. His house was foreclosed on within 60 days. His credit cards were canceled, his bank accounts frozen pending investigation of potential fraud. Within 4 months, Daniel was living in his car and eating at soup kitchens, a stunning fall from middle-class respectability that shocked everyone who knew him. He tried reaching out to Isabella several times, begging for mercy, promising to be a better man if she would just call off her father's campaign against him. Isabella never responded to his messages. Scarlett fared slightly better, managing to find work as a bartender at a chain restaurant 4 states away after changing her name and fabricating her employment history. But her dreams of marrying wealth and living in luxury were over. She'd crossed the wrong family, and the consequences would follow her for the rest of her life. Isabella's baby was born on a snowy March morning. A healthy daughter she named Lucia. Antonio was there for the birth, holding Isabella's hand through the labor and crying when he first held the infant who would become his daughter in every way that mattered. They were married 8 months later in a small ceremony in Santorini, surrounded by family and the friends who had never stopped loving Isabella despite her long absence. Richard walked her down the aisle, tears streaming down his face as he gave his daughter to a man who would cherish her the way she deserved. Antonio adopted Lucia legally before her first birthday, giving her his name and his unconditional love. Daniel had signed away his parental rights so completely that there was no legal connection between him and the child he'd helped create. Isabella's memoir, Coming Home, A Journey from Lost to Found, became a bestseller within weeks of publication. She donated the proceeds to literacy programs and domestic violence shelters, turning her painful experience into something that could help other women find their own strength. 3 years after that devastating afternoon in Daniel's bedroom, Isabella stood on the terrace of her home in Santorini, watching Antonio teach 3-year-old Lucia to swim in the infinity pool below. She was pregnant again, this time with a baby conceived in love and wanted by both parents. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was Daniel, writing from some internet cafe or public library, his latest attempt to make contact. Isabella. The message read, I know I have no right to ask, but I'm desperate. I'm homeless, jobless, and alone. I've learned my lesson. I understand now what I lost when I betrayed you. Could you find it in your heart to forgive me? Could we try again? I'll do anything. Be anyone you need me to be. I still love you. I love our daughter too, even though I never got to meet her. Please, just give me one chance to prove I've changed. Isabella read the message twice, then deleted it without responding. She turned off her phone and went downstairs to join her husband and daughter in the pool, where Lucia was taking her first tentative strokes toward her mother's outstretched arms. Daniel Crawford had made his choice that Wednesday afternoon when he chose his mistress over his wife, his pleasure over his promises, his selfishness over his family. Isabella Salvatore Benedetti had made hers too, and she chose love, dignity, and a future built on truth rather than the ruins of the past. Some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. Some betrayals are so complete that forgiveness becomes irrelevant. And sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's living so well that your former life seems like a bad dream you barely remember. Isabella had learned that attacking a Salvatore came with consequences that lasted a lifetime. But she had also learned that being a Salvatore came with power, privilege, and most importantly, the ability to choose exactly how her story would end. And her story ended with happiness, success, and the kind of love she'd always deserved but had never dared to believe she could find. Daniel's story ended very differently, but that was no longer Isabella's concern. She had chosen her ending, and it was beautiful.